Welcome to the Futurist Society podcast, where we delve into the latest advancements in technology, science, and culture. From discussions on the latest breakthroughs in AI, biotechnology, and space exploration, the Futurist Society is your window into all of the awesomeness that the future holds. Get ready to be informed and inspired as we consider the positive impact of emerging technologies on humanity. Without further ado, welcome your host, Dr. Awesome.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Futurist Society, where we're talking in the present, but talking about the future. Today we have Dr. Rachel Herz, who is a neuroscientist and expert in the field of smell, which is something that I'm particularly interested in. Dr. Herz, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got here and what it is that we're going to be talking with us about today.
Well, I had one of those circuitous paths of least resistance, I like to say. So nothing was straightforward, although I tell this to students all the time. When you do a retrospective on your life history, the narrative totally makes sense. But when you're in it at the moment, it's like complete confusion and chaos. So my background was in biology and then kind of merging with psychology. And at the time, there was no such field as neuroscience. And so what I was really doing was like biopsychology. And after doing an undergraduate degree and taking a year off and not really sure what I was doing with myself, working and traveling during that year, but knowing that I was going to graduate school and somehow in this biopsychology dimension, I ended up starting my PhD. And I'm also Canadian, so I was doing this at the University of Toronto in a lab that was actually studying spatial memory in black-capped chickadees, so birds. And I realized while I was doing that research that although it was interesting and I had fantastic grounding in evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology during that year, which was really important and has really stood me well and been a very guiding force throughout my full career, that birds themselves, nevertheless, were not completely floating my boat. And in the dark hours, when you're a graduate student and feeling like you need the passion to keep yourself going, I recognized that this wasn't really for me. And that actually what I was interested in was humans and somehow bridging the gap between psychological processes and biological mechanisms and sort of figuring out how they interwove. And I'll skip over a little bit, but just to say that during my PhD research, I read a paper where the authors used smell to manipulate mood. And they gave this one paragraph, it had never been done before. And they gave this one paragraph explanation about its sort of evolutionary position and neuroanatomical position and why it was the critical sense to influence emotion in this sort of non-cognitively loaded way. And all of a sudden the light bulb went off and I thought, aha, I can make this connection through the sense of smell and look at something I had always been interested in, which is a connection between smell and emotional memory. And fortunately, my supervisor, although not knowing anything about this topic, was generous enough to say, here's the rope, go hang yourself. I can't help you, but go right ahead. And I actually went to Brown University, which is where I have an adjunct position now. And at the time, the only person who was studying the psychology of smell and who really the father of it was there. And I met with him and he gave me a stack of papers and books and so forth. And I met other people. I actually went to International Flavors and Fragrances in New Jersey and kind of said, can you give me some materials so that I could do my research? And we joke around today that, who is that crazy Canadian graduate student who landed on our doorstep one day? But I got lucky. I developed a paradigm where I could compare sensory experiences in different modalities. So for instance, the scent of popcorn versus hearing popcorn kernels popping, reading the word popcorn, seeing popcorn, feeling popcorn, and so forth, and pairing them with emotional scenes that people then had to remember several days later. And I looked at the accuracy of those memories and a couple of other dimensions relating to that, and then the emotionality of those memories and some other dimensions relating to emotion. And what I found was that there was no difference in accuracy. So you're just as accurate or not recalling what the image was, whether it was a scent, a sight, a sound, etc. That's the trigger. But if the cue that's recalling the memory for you is a scent, that memory experience is much more emotional. And that really separates our sense of smell from other sensory experiences and other memory experiences overall. So it's a special connection between emotion and memory and emotional experience overall. So in any case, that was the beginning. 30 years plus have gone by now, and I'm still working in this sphere as well as relating, many others connected to it. over this time.
So let me ask you a question about that. How are you measuring an emotional experience? When you say one experience is more emotional than another, how is that gauged?
So in my original studies, I did it both through the written descriptions that people gave and basically like analyzing the text for adjectives relating to emotion, also doing simple scales and people rating the memory for how emotional it was, and some other measures that are just pure kind of subjective rating scales. Subsequent to that, I have also done fMRI studies looking specifically at how the amygdala is activated during a memory triggered by a smell compared to recalling that same event through, let's say, a visual modality, and also looking at behavioral measures connected to this. So how do people behave in the presence of a scent that's triggering an emotion, and looking at the behavior as basically a measure of their emotional state.
So I understand the idea of it being like a more emotional experience, but one of the things that I've heard, and I don't know if this is accurate, is that the smell memory lasts for much longer than other memories. Is that accurate or no? Were you saying that they weren't the same?
That is actually a really good point. So that's different from accuracy. The accuracy, and this was only in the studies I've done, I've actually looked at memories, autobiographical memories from people's past, but in this particular study, it was just a 3-day, 2-day lag. So, the time factor wasn't involved. However, it is the case that memories that are connected to a smell tend to be from further back in our past, when it's an autobiographical memory, and they tend, even when they're learned newly, to last longer than memories that are connected to something visual, something auditory, and so forth. And the reason for that has to do with the distinctiveness of scent, because in our daily life, we are encountering so many sights and sounds and all kinds of other information bombarding us, and many of it is the same. So, for instance, when this is the case with smell, it's also the case that these memories don't last particularly long and they're not particularly poignant. So, for example, the smell of coffee is unlikely to be, associated to a specific autobiographical point from 20 years ago in your past. Because you experience coffee so often, it gets overwritten and rewritten and reconnected all the time. But it's often the case that we will experience a particular scent only in one situation. It's only until we come across that scent again does it bring us back. So it has to do with the distinctiveness, the sort of rarity of the scent, the lack of being overwritten over time. And also the fact that when we are first experiencing smells is when we're first learning about them. And many of our first experiences with smell come from childhood, just like with everything else. But with everything else, it tends to be repeated so many times that gets kind of lost in the wash. Whereas with smell, it tends to not get overwritten nearly as much, and so really bring us back to earlier times in our life.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that personally in my own life. Like I remember a few weeks ago, I was walking along and I had a distinct smell that reminded me of my grandparents' house. And I hadn't been there in like 30 years, but I still remember that exact smell of a closet in their house so long ago, right? And so to me, that experience is fascinating for me because I don't remember very much from that young of an age. I don't remember. Honestly, if you were to ask me like my elementary school teachers, like I couldn't rattle them all off for you. There's only a handful that really had a profound experience with me that I could remember them. But that smell in particular, it lasted, and it wasn't even that same scent specifically. It was something that reminded me of that scent, which I thought was so interesting because you don't really have that experience with other memories. Another thing that I wanted to talk with you about is the idea of not only of like the emotional experience, the memory experience, but specifically how it relates to taste, because I know that's a big focus of your work right now. And also it's something that I've just been kind of diving into myself. I just read this really interesting book, Neurogastronomy, and it was talking about all of the different chemical reactions from when you actually experience the taste, how it goes through the brain, how it's interpreted by the brain. And the smell receptors are just totally different from other receptors, right? Like it's something that's as well illustrated in their exact physiology as other receptors. So tell me a little bit more about that, about how smell and taste are interrelated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to just give a little explanation. This book, Neurogastronomy, was written by Gordon Shepherd, and he actually coined that term. And unfortunately, he recently passed away. And but he really began the field of neurogastronomy. And I'm actually on the organizing committee for the International Society for Neurogastronomy that he formerly was involved with and started. So he has left a real legacy in this field. And what neurogastronomy is the combination of a variety of different life experiences, commerce, agriculture, nutrition, medicine, etc., and the senses and neuroscience of how it is that we perceive food and flavor. And so to go back to your point about sort of taste and smell, so taste actually as a sensory system is very simple. It's salt, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami, depending upon, the argument and the camp that you're in. And that's basically it. So from the point of view of the sensations that you get purely from your mouth, that is to do with your tongue, the receptors that are directly inside your mouth, those are very simple experiences. Everything else we experience when it comes to the experience of food is through the nose. Now, I should say that there's also the case of like the feel of fattiness and creaminess, or the burn of like a hot pepper. Those are sort of tactile sensations that also occur within the mouth. But in terms of telling the difference between cured bacon and cured salmon, that is through our nose, because otherwise the taste is just salty and maybe it also feels a little fatty, let's just say. But everything else that we experience has to do with our sense of smell. And that's because there's two routes to smelling. We think about smell normally in terms of sniffing, like I'm sniffing the rose or something like that. And that's the scent coming through our nostrils and hitting the olfactory epithelium, which is where the sensory neurons are, basically also right at the level of our eyebrow. And that's coming from our nostrils directly as we inhale. But there's another route that also brings aroma chemicals to the sensory neurons, the exact same place, and that's through our mouth. And that's because, as anyone knows from having a cold or maybe bad allergies or something like that, when your nose is blocked, food doesn't taste right. Or maybe when you were a kid and like making your sibling or your friend laugh and they had something in their mouth and then it came out their nose. If you've ever had any experience relating to that, then you know that there's this open system between our mouth and our nose. And this open system, this open airway passage, which is at the back of the mouth, enables us to experience the aromatic chemicals that are from the food we're eating at the same time as the taste. And it actually has to do very critically with being able to breathe. So if you can't breathe, you're not going to be able to experience this. So we inhale while we have food in our mouth, and the aromatic chemicals go up through the back of the mouth and into the nose and get to that same spot with the sensory neurons. And then we exhale, and that whoosh of air out is actually creating that sensation that we get the full aroma. It's happening simultaneously as we're experiencing salty, sour, sweet, whatever. And the brain then fuses those two experiences together and we get flavor. But because the food is in our mouth physically, we always think that it's coming from our mouth. And because we know that taste is in the mouth, people always say, like the taste of bacon, the taste of chocolate, the taste of caramel, salted ice cream. But actually, the only thing that you're tasting is salt or sweet or bitter or sour. Everything else comes from our nose. And if you have your nose blocked, or people lose their sense of smell, which has happened so much more frequently since COVID or as a function of COVID, then that experience of food is totally lost. And so there's no way to tell the difference between an apple and a potato, for example, if you have your eyes closed, because the sensory experience is only this kind of bland, slightly sour, maybe mealy, kind of maybe slightly sweet experience, but it's everything else comes from your nose.
Yeah, no, I really like that distinction he made in the book between orthonasal smell and retronasal smell. I felt like that was something that it just kind of clicked for me. And now I feel like that I have some awareness of it. My experience with food is totally different. It's much more layered, and I enjoy so much more about it. And so that's something that I really credit this book for. But I know that that's some stuff that you're looking into also. So can you tell us about just the enjoyment of food and how smell relates with that?
Yeah, sure. So my most recent book is called Why You Eat What You Eat, the Science Behind Our Relationship with Food. And it really kind of breaks neurogastronomy and the book that you read down to a much more, I think, approachable, simpler, not that it's simple, but kind of going into all the different dimensions, not just the sensory and the neuroscience, but also the emotional, the social, the environmental, and much more of the experiential end of things. So there's a lot that goes into our emotional experience and our enjoyment of food. And it really depends on, really 1,000 different things at any given moment. For example, who you're eating with, how the food looks, what the situation is for eating it. Is it a special celebration? Is it that you're giving yourself a reward for having done something, or like giving yourself a special treat? Is it food that someone who you love prepared for you? So like the comfort food idea, or eating a food because it's connected to the food that you ate when you were a child, which is comfort food. Or are you having to eat a meal with people that you don't like? Or, what is this? Is the situation something where the music's really loud and clamoring, and you're like, I have to get out of here? So there's so many features that go into our experience of food that we often have no idea about. And one of the things that I wanted to do in my book is to give people the awareness and the knowledge and the understanding of all the variables that are affecting them, so that then they could feel that they have power and control over their relationship with food, and then don't feel like food is controlling them. So understanding all the different vectors that are hitting us all at once when we're experiencing something, it goes way beyond, sweet and the smell of chocolate, for example, if you're eating something chocolate. And there's a direct effect between for example, sugar and fatty foods actually trigger the reward center in our brain, and in fact can also trigger the analgesic sort of opioid system in our brain. So in fact, if you stub your toe and have some really high-end European chocolate that's both sweet and high in fat, that there's actually an analgesic effect to that. Likewise, if we're in a really depressed state emotionally, food does not taste as fatty or as sweet, so that we could eat more of it in a way to get that sensory experience we're craving, because the neurotransmitters that are being activated as a function of our being depressed actually suppress the sensations of pleasure, like sweetness and fattiness.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. I mean, the idea of super tasters and difference in skill level with taste. I wouldn't say skill level, but there's people who are super tasters and they tend to have a better BMI, a better, overall physiology when it comes to that kind of stuff. And I wonder if it's just because people who are not able to have as strong of a taste sensation have experience what you're experiencing, where it's just not as fatty to them, it's not as sugary to them, and so therefore they eat more of it just to get that same kind of satiation. But do you have any research in that field at all?
Yeah, so the idea, super tasters, tasters and non-tasters, that's something you're born with. It's purely genetic. There's nothing that you can do to hone that or get that in any, changed way. And interestingly, though, what you're saying, most chefs tend to be super tasters. However, I know of one very famous chef who in fact is a non-taster, and that he feels has helped inform him because, the way that it breaks down in the population in terms of the percentage of people who are tasters, non-tasters, super tasters, is approximately in thirds. It depends, actually, there's a couple of other things. So racial genetic backgrounds, can alter this in terms of specific ethnicities and populations. There's a little bit of a difference also between males and females, but in terms of in a gross sense, it's basically, thirds of the population. And the fact that the majority is not a super taster means that, for instance, people coming to your restaurant are not potentially tasting the food or experiencing the food the same way as a chef who's a super taster is. And so he feels like, him being a non-taster gives him a different perspective. But regardless, what you're saying is actually correct, that the sensory experience of food for a super taster is much more intense. So salty is saltier, sweeter is sweeter, bitter in particular is much more aversive. And what this means, and fattiness is much more creamy, the burn of a hot pepper is more stinging and so forth. So that tends to mean that people who are super tasters need less of whatever it is to get the maximum experience for them. Now, that being said, interestingly, the one area where super tasters overdo it is actually with salt. And so there's also, and from the point of view of health factors that connect to being a super taster or a non-taster, it is the case that overall, BMI tends to be lower in a healthier range for people who are super tasters. This is on average compared to non-tasters. Non-tasters also possibly have the potential to being more susceptible to certain drugs of abuse like alcohol and smoking, because both of those substances are burning in the mouth. And if you didn't have very much burning, then when you were a kid, it was easier to like empty your parents' vodka than it is if you're like, that really hurts, so I'm not going to do it. So those kinds of things tend to sort of be where the kind of health vulnerabilities of non-tasters fall. But super tasters, because they find bitter so aversive, avoid the healthy leafy greens. So they're more susceptible to several types of cancers, especially colon cancer. And because saltiness, in fact, blocks bitter taste, they're used to putting a lot of salt on their food, and using a lot of salt, as you know, can lead to hypertension. So there are kind of like, non-perfection, aspects, vulnerabilities, et cetera, for being a super tasters versus a non-taster. Tasters, which are the Goldilocks middle group, probably are the best overall because they get the taste. It's not quite as strong as the super tasters, but they don't have the sort of susceptibilities that some non-tasters could have.
What's interesting to me is that taste is also defined by genetics, correct?
Well, that is the super taster thing, yeah.
Yeah, but it's so that's interesting to me because I feel like my experience with vision and touch and all of these other senses that we have, even hearing, is pretty well regulated. Like, I mean, granted, there's outliers like color blindness and things like that, but it's pretty consistent throughout the population. But there's just so much variability when it comes to taste. What do you have any comment on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, there's not that much variability with taste. With taste, it's really the genetic component is primarily to do with super taster or non-taster. That has to do with a difference of an allele basically at one place on a particular chromosome. So you either have, two sets of one, heterozygous, one of each, or two sets of the other. However, with smell, it is the case that it is the most vastly variable genetics of any experience, actually completely any experience. Everyone, in fact, has a unique nose. And what I mean by that is that the specific receptors that are expressed in every individual for being able to detect smells is ever so slightly different because of the genetics behind it for every single person, except potentially if you have an identical twin. So this is actually something which makes the sense of smell absolutely individualistic. The sense of taste, because it's simpler from that perspective, there are other factors that are involved with some of the genetics behind taste, but genetically speaking, taste is still relatively simple. But combined with smell, because that's what food is and flavor, you do get this huge variability. So the perception of a chocolate that you and I are both consuming is not going to be the same for each of us, even if we're both, let's say, super tasters, because our sense of smell is different. And so our experience of the flavor is going to be at least slightly, if not even more than that, different between the two of us. Plus our subjective experiences that go behind what it is that led us to liking or disliking these flavors and foods and so on are going to have an impact. And then, like I mentioned before, the circumstances, the situation, a lot of other things, how hungry we are, of course.
So when you hear about findings like cilantro tasting different to different people, or umami being different in different populations, is that more due to smell or is that more due to taste?
So umami, again, that is taste. A smell, the reason why people either love or hate cilantro is because they are missing or are not missing a specific olfactory receptor. So the cilantro experience is all about smell. So interestingly, people who hate cilantro are actually missing a specific receptor. So they only get the kind of soapy notes of cilantro, whereas people who have the receptor that's responsible for the really herbaceous, delicious quality, if you have it and you like cilantro, have that receptor which basically blocks most of the soapiness, so they don't really get so much soapiness.
So that's a very specific attribute. Are there other specific attributes of smell that have been identified like that?
Yes, there's a whole set of specific anosmias. So that is to say, you are unable to, you have a normal sense of smell, but it's like being colorblind for something very specific. Like you can't smell freesia flowers, or one of the most common ones is a certain type of musk. And there's a whole set of these things. Actually, kind of a slightly funny example, people who eat asparagus and afterwards, if they go to the bathroom, they may or may not notice a particular scent. And that is to do with two things. One, whether or not they have the olfactory receptor to detect that scent, which is in P, and also whether or not they're what are known as expressors, that is to say that they metabolize that asparagus into the constituents that lead to this particular scent. So that's genetic as well. So if you are both an expressor and you also have the olfactory sensory neuron to detect it, then after asparagus, you can make jokes with your friends. But if you either don't metabolize it that way, which is one particular thing, you may not know that or not, or don't have the receptor, then it's going to be something different. So, I mean, not to get gross, but if you wanted to find out if you were just not, metabolizing, or if you didn't have the olfactory receptor, someone who that does metabolize asparagus that way, can go to the bathroom, and then you can walk in afterwards and test your nose. So anyway, this is a little bit of a, grade 3 test for the boys out there.
No, I mean, honestly, it's super interesting. It's something that I hadn't really thought of before until I happened to come across your TED Talk. And then I just did like this deep dive into it, because I feel like, my area of expertise is the head and neck. And I feel like it's a very often neglected A, sense, but B, area of understanding, right? Like for example, if somebody comes in to see me and has a facial fracture and then they lose their sense of smell because of that, it's just something that we're like, okay, they lost a sense of smell, move on. It's not really given the credit that it's due. I didn't realize the depth of the human experience that was determined by smell, and I really appreciate you getting the word out, because I feel like, especially in 2023, the whole purpose of this podcast is to look towards the future. And I think that one of the things that has been a common thread is the dynamic of the human experience is going to be increasing. A lot of this technology that's coming down the road is going to make us more, hopefully, connected, more time with our family and friends, hopefully. That's the best case scenario. But then there's whole subjects that are just really not given what I think the credit they're due, and I think that smell is one of them. And the whole reason I got into this is the Nobel Prize was given to somebody that was determined these smell receptors, right? And I didn't know anything about them, and so I did a deep dive into it, and that's how I got from like one point to the other. But very circuitous route, similar to what you're saying. Have you noticed a lot more focus on smell these days, or is it still very much underrepresented?
So a couple things. I just want to backtrack a little bit on what you just said. So first of all, so Linda Buck and Richard Axel actually did that work and published in Cell when I had first started my PhD research. And, it's very gratifying that they got the Nobel Prize in 2004 for this discovery of the genetics of the olfactory receptors. And what you've also said, though, about your experience with patients is really meaningful to me, because my first book, which is called The Scent of Desire, came out of the first time I was ever an expert witness, which was for a woman who lost her sense of smell in a car accident that was actually pretty bad. And she'd gone through several reconstructive facial surgeries as a function of, being in this traumatic car accident. And by the time I met her, which was about a year and a half later, she was all put back together again, but had realized that through the damage that had been done in this accident, and I don't know if maybe part of it was also to do with the surgery, probably not, probably to do with what happened in the accident itself. But in any case, she was left without a sense of smell. And her entire life was turned upside down and going downhill very quickly. And it was all to do with her smell loss. And she was beside herself because she had never put any stead into her sense of smell before. She'd never paid any attention to it. She never cared about it. She had no idea that it was influencing really anything. I mean, maybe like most people are realizing, oh yeah, food, that's something of an impact, or I couldn't smell the gas if, that had happened, or the smoke. But actually, it affected everything. And for her, I mean, she sort of was the poster child for me at that moment. And very, I really felt then I had to get the word out, as you say, to have people recognize the gift that they have, if they have a sense of smell, to, stop and smell the roses and appreciate it. Because her person, like, she was newly married and she felt like she couldn't be intimate with her husband anymore. She just had wanted to have children. She felt like she couldn't be a good mother because she couldn't bond with her child, because she wouldn't be able to smell her child, and also really worried that she was like going to burn the house down, if she was baking cookies, and wouldn't be able to, let's say, smell it. Her sense of being able to be out in the world, I mean, she started to get really paranoid about her personal odor, her sense of socializing. She felt like she couldn't connect with other people, so she started to become more and more reclusive. She had a high level kind of analytical job, and because of where in the brain smell is processed, it's involved also in our spatial memory, learning, sort of analysis capabilities, and those sorts of things start faltering when you don't have input from your sense of smell, just at a sort of neuroanatomical mechanics level. Same thing with emotion. She was going into a spiraling, ever worsening depression. And so it was just absolutely everything about her life. And this is, in fact, what happens to people, not necessarily 100% of all the factors, and not for everybody who's lost their sense of smell, but variations of the sort of disconnect that people experience in their life with other people and even themselves, sort of emotional deadening, or like they can't get the vibrancy that they had before. Their experience of just a whole variety of walking outside and it smelling like fall, or whatever the case might be, all those kinds of things are gone. And when people lose their sense of smell, and it has become a really serious issue because of COVID. I mean, so first of all, especially in the first variants, loss of smell was actually a great symptom indicator that you had COVID. In fact, we did a study which showed that loss of smell preceded showing a positive PCR test for COVID. This was in the first version of it, by 2 whole days. So it was an incredible diagnostic, having this sort of smell loss. But for most people, it was transient, they got their sense of smell back. But for actually now, I would say, dozens of millions of people worldwide have still long-term, sort of long COVID version, with smell loss being the critical symptom that has been maintained. And, I have great hope, and I think there's real optimism for the future in terms of medicine in and of itself. So first of all, there's the possibility that they will get their sense of smell back naturally, and there's things they can do to sort of just, from the comfort of their homes, like smell exercises, literally, sniffing deliberately and so forth, and doing that a lot can help bring back the sense of smell. But also coming down the pipeline in the pharmaceutical, in the neurological, and in sort of the world of medicine, there are going to be, real treatments for people who have smell loss. So I'm optimistic that those people will get solutions and get their sense of smell back in the not too distant future. But this is really because so many people experienced, even if it was just transient, what life is like without a sense of smell. I think it really did increase appreciation and awareness of this sense. That being said, I did a study that data was collected in the spring of 2021. So still like in the height of COVID and things like that. We had 2 groups of population, as it were, so participants. One were college students, so we had 200 or so college students, and then we had another group, 200 or so, 40-ish people, 40-somethings, and looked at how they valued their sense of smell relative to the other senses, and also compared to various common commodities. And just to give you sort of course, sense of smell compared to vision and hearing. We didn't compare the other senses in that particular study. Subsequently, we've gone on to replicate this. We actually have it in 7 different languages across the globe, and thousands of data points now, getting very similar findings. But in any case, right then and there, what we found is that sense of smell ranked, way down compared to vision and hearing. Vision and hearing ranked similarly. But this was the headline finding. 25% of college students would rather give up their sense of smell than their cell phone. Nearly.
Oh my God.
Nearly 50% of women would rather give up their sense of smell than their hair. Okay.
Oh my God.
So, one of the things that I've said though is like, it would have been interesting if we would have done this study, let's say in 2015, to compare it to the data that we collected from 2021. Maybe, in 2015, it would have been 50% of college students would have given up their sense of smell for their cell phone. So, and maybe if we, as this study is done again and again, I'm hoping that we see a shift further in favor of the sense of smell. But in any case, it still is a real indictment for people not recognizing the importance of smell. That's
really interesting. This whole podcast is about giving people an optimistic view of the future, and that's something that I see in my own family members, like their addiction to their cell phone, and I hope that it's a good thing from humanity. I do like face interaction more now that I have this digital presence. I think that I value it more, so I hope that in the same way that these other things have come up, maybe we'll value our sense of smell more, because there are other things that provide a significant distinction between an in-person interaction. Because right now, that's not something you can replicate, right? Like you can replicate vision like we're talking right now. You can replicate audio like we're talking right now, but you can't really do the sense of smell. It's a totally different scenario. But I wanted to talk with you more about the taste and oral connection, because that's one of my areas of focus. Certainly, like when I reconstruct somebody and they lose half of their mandible or something like that, their quality of life plummets, right? And they still have their sense of taste, but the ability to chew and make those volatile particles that actually hit the back of the throat so that it proceeds with sense receptors or the smell receptors, they're not able to do that. And so when we're talking about the oral and taste connection, I think that that's a significant thing, but that's coming from my perspective. What is your perspective on it?
So, well, that's really interesting to me. So that you've shared this is actually, I had no idea that the chewing was now going to be impaired for people who've had this, lower mandible surgery, or that they have, loss of that bone. And obviously made complete sense. And I mean, absolutely, it is a problem. I mean, one of the things I would maybe say is that, spending more time, and you use the correct terms, orthonasally sniffing while eating would be helpful for those people. So for instance, the food is in front of them and they can smell it if it's in front of them, because their sense of smell still works. So they can sniff the creamy potatoes and the charred, grilled, whatever it is that they're eating, or, whatever. So they can spend more time maybe deliberately sniffing, even if once the food is in their mouth, they aren't able to do as much chewing. But then that brings up a question, which I have: does that mean those people actually have to have soft foods only and basically liquid diet? Because then, in a way, what I just said wouldn't be so much of a solution. But I would still say, even if it were just liquid, and the liquids at least were things that they liked, then spending more time sniffing the liquids to get some of that pleasure from, what those liquids represent. I don't know if they're savory ones as well. Hopefully there are, and then, sweet ones and so forth, to sort of spend a little bit more time being present with the aroma that they're sniffing, even though they're not able to get that much. However, even if they're actually, it is the case that we do get retronasal olfaction from beverages. So it's not as strong because the time in the mouth is much faster. Typically, we take a sip, we swallow pretty quickly, so we get less. But obviously, drinking wine, just drinking other things, drinking even coffee or hot chocolate, you are getting the retronasal, you are getting the aroma from the mouth. So one of the things might also be to sort of keep whatever food that is in your mouth a little bit longer before swallowing, or just being a little bit like not chugging things back, not just drinking the food for the nutrition in and of itself and not paying any attention to anything else. Maybe spending a little bit more time with the drink so that you can sort of appreciate the flavors that are in it a little bit more and maybe get some pleasure out of it. Although I can see that probably in situations like this, not only are the foods liquid, but they're probably not that variable. So like you have pretty much a lot of the same thing over and over again. And that in and of itself creates displeasure, as it were, with whatever we're consuming. I mean, there's something quite well known called sensory specific satiety, which is really related to food. And basically it means if you're eating this, and not the same thing can happen with beverages, obviously, but eating the same thing over and over again, you basically satiate on the sensory aspect of it, and you lose the pleasure from the sensation. I mean, this happens with all of us all the time. Like you get, I use chocolate because I love chocolate, but like, fantastic piece of chocolate cake. And you take the first bite, oh, it's amazing, second bite, third bite. Well, maybe by the fifth bite, though, it's lost its, fantastic oomph. And that's because you're actually satiating on the sensory characteristics. You're satiating on the aroma of chocolate. You're satiating on the sweet taste. You're satiating on the creamy feel. So, and you're also physiologically adapting to it, so it's less intense. And so that actually, especially if diets are very consistent because of being forced to only have, a pretty small or narrow repertoire of what you can consume, I can see that that would be, quite problematic. And what ends up happening, when people have very monotonous diets, is they end up typically not eating enough and losing weight or not getting enough nutrition because the food is so monotonous. And I can see that that would be a problem for patients who were forced into a liquid diet and didn't have the opportunity for, that variety that keeps them kind of the engagement going with the food that they're eating.
Yeah, the function of chewing, I feel like, is something similarly to smell has been underrepresented in the health literacy. And the reason being is because, I can make someone look totally normal, but if they don't have the ability to chew, they come to me and they complain about how terrible their life is, And if I can make someone look okay, but I can give them the function to chew and to enjoy food, very few complaints. That's something that I've noticed in my practice. And I think so much of our identity as humans is wrapped up in food. I mean, in this neurogastronomy book that he was saying that, the evolution of smell was something that is different for humans than other animals. And some people describe it as one of the distinctions is that our pleasure for food grew our brain capacities so much so that now we are where we are. And I see it daily on when my patients come into me, and the ones that aren't able to chew, they're not able to really enjoy food because a certain amount of texture and the way it fits in your mouth, that's part of the taste, overall flavor sensation too, correct?
Right. So definitely, for people who have lost their sense of smell, some things that help make food more pleasurable is having things with very variable texture. So crunchy and creamy and like a grape that's popping in your mouth at the same time. So getting a lot of dynamics from texture can help people who have smell loss try to experience the pleasure of food again. But something that I write about also in Why You Eat What You Eat is the fact that humans actually are unique in having this open airway between their mouth and their nose, which gives us the ability to experience flavor. So unlike any other animal, even animals that have exquisite senses of smell, like for instance, your dog may drop the piece of bacon on the floor and they're at it in a nanosecond, but all they've really experienced in their mouth is the saltiness. They have smelled the bacon aroma before they get to it, but then in their mouth, it's just the saltiness. Unlike us, we get the full, aromatics of it while we're eating. Now, the fact that we have this open airway system is actually how we are also able to have language. I mean, the complexities of what we are able to do with speech and create sounds that are intelligible into all the different meanings of language across the globe has to do with having this open airway system. And the risk of having this open airway system with eating is actually choking. So other animals do not have to worry about choking while they're eating because of the fact that they're talking at the same time. Because, for instance, inhaling while you have food in your mouth can end up, lodging a piece of food in your windpipe, and then with the opportunity of potentially choking. Whereas if you don't have this open airway system, then that's not a risk. But sort of evolutionarily speaking, the benefits of language for humans outweighed the risk of choking while talking and eating at the same time, which is why, if you learn when you were a kid, don't eat with your mouth, don't talk with your mouth full. That is actually not just for, the manners of the table, but also to keep you alive. Because if you're eating and talking with your mouth full, then you have a good chance of choking. But yeah, so this is actually what gives humans the unique ability to experience flavor and also the unique ability to have language.
Yeah. So honestly, this was so interesting. And I wish I could talk to you for more. Before we get into our last three questions, I feel like a lot of what you were saying was descriptive. I've learned a lot from talking to you over this past hour. But if you could give a proscriptive talk to me about how do I make my patients healthier through their sensation of flavor and taste and smell? What would you say to that? Because I know that's part of the research that you're doing as well, is more of a holistic interpretation of food so that we can actually have better health outcomes, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that, understanding all the things that go into our experience of eating, and again, not to mention my book, Why You Eat What You Eat, but really all those things that we don't pay attention to, understanding, how it is that the person you're with, the mood that you're in, the environment, the colors around you, the way things look, all those things are actually interacting with your experience with food. And if we just slow down, I mean, I really actually don't like the term mindfulness. It's overused and it kind of is abused as well, I think. But if we could literally be mindful in the moment and sort of paying attention to our experience with eating, then we get so much more out of it. We get much more intense flavor. I mean, it actually will taste stronger when you're paying attention to it than if you're not. I mean, I'm sure that your listeners have had the experience of, you have a bowl of potato chips or whatever, candies or something beside the computer or in front of you while you're watching TV or whatever, and you're, eating away, and all of a sudden you notice that A, the bowl is empty, and B, you didn't even get any of the goodness. Like, hey, I was looking forward to eating those chips, and what? I already ate them? No way, it's not possible. So the fact that when we pay attention to the food that we're consuming, we get much more hedonic pleasure from consuming it. We actually get more satiated. That is to say, we feel more full, but because we've engaged with eating it, we actually go, oh yeah, I did eat that bowl. It is empty for a reason. And I got, real pleasure from it. And we are also, much more in the moment, which I think is a good thing in any case. So I think it's really important, just as a basic principles for health in general and eating, not to eat while doing other things, especially, with screens. So, paying attention to, so I definitely think it's good to eat with other people, but it is also the case that the more people that we eat with, the more we tend to eat and the less we are actually aware of what we're eating. So, like Thanksgiving coming up, it's a time when we all eat a great deal for several reasons. One, because there's so much variety. So the more variety there is, the more we're going to consume. And it's relating to that sensory specific satiety that I mentioned before. So I finished with the cranberries. Now I've got the sweet potatoes. Then I have the baked potatoes, and I move on to the stuffing. So all these different things that we have room for because it's different. But it's also the case that we're eating with a lot of people, usually a lot more than we usually eat with. And the conversation and the distraction of being with those people also takes us away from what it feels like to be eating whatever it is. And I'm really getting some pleasure from this. And I'm getting the specific flavors and the nuances and everything else. So although it is really good to have food as part of our social existence, and it is so much part of our social existence and really important for that, it's also important to pay attention to the sensory experience, the emotional experience, the hedonic and holistic experience of what it is that we're consuming to get the most out of it.
Speaking of Thanksgiving, do you think it's because there's just so many options? Because I feel like when I go to Thanksgiving, like I want to try a little bit of everything, which makes me end up eating more. Is that the case, or is it like more so that you're just around a lot of people? What would you say is the reasoning behind that?
So I would say that the number one reason is the variety. I mean, the other people being there is definitely a contributing factor, but Thanksgiving is like the all-you-can-eat buffet. So if you ever go to a restaurant which has an all-you-can-eat buffet, you could be there by yourself. The same kind of thing happens. Like, I'll have a little bit of this, try a little bit of that. You want to try everything. Yeah. And the fact that everything tastes kind of at least a little bit different means that you're going to eat at least some of it before you move on to the next thing. And often we eat all of it and then often go back for more. One of the things also I talk about in Why You Eat What You Eat is that if you want to resist going back for seconds or thirds at an all-you-can-eat buffet, sit as far away from the buffet display as possible, because actually humans are reasonably lazy. So if we don't see it, if it's not really an arm's length away, we're less likely to get up and go get more. I mean, and again, Thanksgiving, you don't have to move anywhere. Typically, it's right there on the table. So it's easy to, I'll have another scoop of those mashed potatoes, or I'll take, yes, you're passing the stuffing around again. Sure, I'll have another. So that's one of the problems, I guess, with Thanksgiving.
That's a very timely way to leave this program today. Before we go to the end of our show, we're going to talk to you a little bit about our 3 questions that we ask all of our guests. Number 1 is, what do you gain inspiration from? Like when you went down this path of deciding to spread the word about smell and taste. For me, when I do this podcast, science fiction is something that I gain inspiration from. I really want to have that utopian view of the future that is available in many different science fiction outlets. But for you, Dr. Hertz, what is it that you look towards for your inspiration?
Well, I look to, actually sharing and talking with other people really gives me a lot of inspiration and energy. I mean, when I talk to other scientists, and what's happening now in the field of smell is absolutely incredible. I mean, we are on the fastest rising trajectory, both in medicine and technology, than we've ever been before. And what's coming is really exciting. And so I'm inspired by that. I'm also at another level, actually, as you may have noticed, I've mentioned dogs a few times. So I'm very inspired by my dog. Who spends a lot of her time sniffing. And, I look at her and I think, she's taking in the moment. She's really learning things. She's, basically she's on her social media apps as we're taking walks, sniffing in various places. And I think that's kind of inspiring to me. I mean, at another level where I get my sort of downtime thinking, I love mysteries. So from, a reading perspective, I'm all about reading mysteries and listening to mysteries too, because I spend a lot of time outside, walking my dog, looking at her sniffing, and then listening to books as well.
Great.
So that's probably part of it. And then I try to also pay attention to my own experience as much as I can, sort of, what was that I just had? But I really get inspiration and gratification when I can make, or I see the light bulb go off in someone else and they go, oh yeah, like smell is really important. And I never realized that. And, I do get that also with teaching and with students, and that's extremely rewarding and gratifying.
So one of the things that you kind of hinted at was that there's some breakthroughs coming down the pipeline for smell and taste. What are the ones that you're most excited about?
Well, there's a lot I'm excited about. I've already mentioned that I think in medicine and therapeutics, there's things that are really going to change the world for people who have lost a sense of smell. But also, you mentioned that, with screens and everything, we really don't have that sensory dimension. But that's actually going to be changing very soon as well. And coming to your smartphone in the near future, you're going to be able to have, and your tablet or your laptop, have sort of a really small add-on, that, piece of hardware, which will enable you to smell and create different smells and share smells. And also, for example, that you and I, we're separated by the screen. You said you're in New York, I'm in Rhode Island. Behind you is the universe from the point of view of what I can see from you. But if you and I, for instance, both had a scent cartridge on our tablets or our laptops, and we tuned it to the same scent, you would be experiencing and I'd be experiencing the same smell. And even though we have different noses, we would be sharing that scent experience in real time. And that would actually give us another level of connection. It would sort of break this fourth wall of the screen between us in a very visceral and emotional way that's completely different than what we're sharing right now. Even though we have 2 senses, this third one, because it will be so much more emotional and visceral, because that really is what distinguishes the sense of smell from everything else, will give us a level of interconnectedness that we probably don't realize is extremely intense and would change a lot.
So last question, where do you see us in 10 years? What do you see us as a species having more focus on smell, maybe having a better sense of taste? But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you see coming down the pipeline for us.
So I have both a utopian and a dystopian view of this.
Let's just take the dystopian out of the equation. This is utopian visions only.
Okay. All right, so utopian only, then I would say that what I just talked about with respect to technology and science and medicine will enable, first of all, more people to smell. One of the other things that's really critical is as we get older, our sense of smell, just like with vision and hearing, tends to get worse. And along with it, there's an extremely important interaction between our ability to smell and our cognitive capabilities. And so keeping our sense of smell healthy as we get older and as the population is aging, that will actually keep us smarter, more mentally active, and also be important for our physical health. So I think just being able to smell has tremendous spillover into both our mental and neurological and physical health. And the technologies and therapies that are being developed will enable that. So that's something that I'm really excited about. And also what I just mentioned, the fact that our technologies will have smell as part of them will mean even though we may be separated by computers, we're still going to be a lot more connected than we are now, because the sense of smell will give us this interconnectedness that will really change things in a positive way.
Great. Well, I like that utopian vision. I look at it as that now more than ever, people are focusing on what they're eating, what they're tasting, what they're smelling. And I think that that's produced really good results. You know, like the food that I had this today was better than the food that was available to me 20 years ago. I feel like that there's a new focus on better ingredients and health and a whole wellness industry that really didn't exist 30 years ago. And I really appreciate that. And a lot of it has to do with people understanding themselves and how we operate better. So thank you so much, Dr. Herz, for joining us today. And to all of our listeners, please like and subscribe, and we will see you again in the future. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
We appreciate you taking part in today's episode. Take this chance to reimagine a better future by joining a community of futurists who strive for a remarkable world. Be a part of this growing network and contribute to making the world a more positive place. Visit thefuturistsociety.net and subscribe to the show so you don't miss a drop of hopeful futurism.